Genesis chapter 5. We will be in this review. We're trying to get through sections of Genesis at a time and gather up all the pieces and remember what the point and purpose was as we go through. Once we had finally made it to the end of Genesis, right, after years of this, we want to go back and gather things up. And so we have been reviewing. This is now the fourth message in the review. So we reviewed Genesis chapter 1 verses 2, 3. And then we had two messages we reviewed from there up into the beginning of chapter 4. And here we are now in chapter 5, all the way down to chapter 6, verse 8. So 5:1 through 6:8 is kind of one section. And then in chapter 6, verse 9, begins a new section. These are the generations of Noah. And it begins to tell what significant thing happened in Noah's day and what came from Noah in this favor he had with God. Are we all ready then? Okay. Let's pray first. Heavenly Father, again, we come to this portion of our gathering where we have set aside time to give attention to your word, some portion of it. Lord, our confidence is that it's living and active, that it's an eternal seed that might be planted in our hearts and yield growth and fruit for eternity. And so we come with the weight of that and that expectation that the truths contained here would not just be learned objectively, but would be internalized by your Spirit, moving, working among us even now. We ask you to help us to hear with hearing ears and to see with seeing eyes. Amen. Well, in this book that we call Genesis, Moses, under the guidance and direction of God, is seeking to equip the people of Israel with a proper understanding and a true history of their place in the world. That's just where this is historically, as Moses is leading the people of Israel out and writing this book. They need to have a proper understanding of who they are and a true history of their place in the world. They had with them in Egypt an oral history from their ancestors, and no doubt there were also some historical documents kept somewhere within the nation. We will see evidence of that here in a moment. But generally, they were a nation of slaves coming out of the spiritual darkness of Egypt and moving in a few years into the perversity and the idolatry of the land of Canaan. This is who they were and where they were headed. Such circumstances as this could not make for a Godward culture for the nation apart from a proper understanding of God and of their place in His purposes for the world. And this is what Moses is seeking to provide them. This is the purpose and the point of Genesis. That's Moses' reason for writing. By way of very quick review, first he began by telling us that God is the sole creator of the heavens and the earth. We learn that the earth was in this first instance an uninhabitable, dark, watery wasteland. But God then deliberately moved in to begin forming this place and filling it with creatures. In one remarkable command after another, or what you might call just a declaration of His will, God established light and set its appointed times of day and night. He separated the waters into above and below. He caused the dry land to appear. He caused the dry land to sprout vegetation and to grow every kind of plant, whether with the seeds scattered abroad or with the seeds in the fruit. And then into these realms of day and night sea and sky and the dry land, God placed the objects and creatures to rule, multiply, and fill them. He made the greater and the lesser lights to rule the day and the night skies, and these two, together with the stars, were to serve as markers for times and seasons. He filled the sky above and the waters beneath with birds and creatures of the seas, to swarm and fill those realms with all the variety of life that they exhibit. He commanded the earth to bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, and they appeared, and everything was good. Then God did a new thing entirely, and He made mankind in His own image to have dominion in the earth and to steward the creation of God. Man was the vice-regent of God on the earth. He ruled the world for God, according to God's will and command and intention and desire. Having completed His work, God rested from it, or I might say better, rested in it, satisfied and joyful. In a celebratory act, He set aside His seventh day as holy, having consecrated all of His work unto Himself, enjoying the very good creation that He has now made. It was satisfying to Him. Next, Moses, having stated all that and laid it out, Moses addresses the obvious question any reader would have, namely, what happened? And to this question, Moses gives a very thorough answer in terms of the nature of the problem and how personal and relational it was and how big a schism it created between God and man, and the way that man has willfully persisted in that endeavor to rebel against and to defy God. Mankind was given, this is Genesis chapter 2, verses 4, all the way to the end of chapter 4. Mankind was given every blessing and benefit imaginable. Not only was creation satisfying to God, it was fulfilling to mankind. Man had everything. But a rebellion against God took place, occasioned by an evil spiritual creature from the heavenly realm. It deceived the woman into the only sort of act that could be disobedience. And on that occasion, the man willfully transgressed God's prohibition with eyes wide open, defying the authority of God. He refused to act in the fear of God and sought to be his own master. And in that act, the creation order of God is overturned on the earth because all of it was created with one design, one purpose. It wasn't like God made certain things and then as an add-on added other things, but rather had in mind an entire creation, and mankind ruling for God was part of that. And God fellowshipping with man openly in righteousness was part of that. That capstone of the creation was overturned and upended as man rebelled against God and defied it. And so the whole created order is upended. As a consequence, we learn first about the natural devastation that such failure has upon people. Before God even showed up to address the issue, the man and the woman are no longer unashamed in one another's company. They're no longer open. They rather are guilty within. They're fearful of others. They're hiding from God. All of that is just a natural and massive result of having sinned. It's inevitable. But in response then to the sinful act of man, God Himself responds. But His first response is not one of judgment upon man, but rather a curse upon the serpent, that spiritual being who occasioned the sin. And also there was a declaration by God that His original design of ruling the world through man would not be destroyed, but rather would be set right by one who would, in fact, be born of a woman. There was this fierce determination by God to set all of this right, not by working around His created order. He kind of set it up, well, I'll kind of come in from the side and change it all. Not by that, but rather by working within that established order. The world is to be ruled by men. He would work within that framework, and by a man would restore it and defeat what had come against it and renew this thing and set it right. A man was going to do that. God determined that's going to happen. It's amazing. He could have done it with a command, just changed it all back the way it would have been. But he didn't do that. He had established this thing, and he wasn't going to let these things, this matter of sin, interfere. Nevertheless, there were and there are, still to this day, terrible consequences for humanity for having sinned against this great and good God. The male and female relationship, childbearing and child rearing are all made into painful, troublesome features of life, despite their good and natural features. Life itself also becomes a terribly difficult endeavor, as man is barred from the tree of life and the garden riches of Eden, and must now make his way in the wild world outside the garden with thorns and thistles and a hard, sweaty existence until one day dying and returning to the dust again. Man who was dust had been exalted to rule the earth and now returned back to dust. You know, that thing you wipe off your feet, that nuisance. That's man. What a foolish thing we had done in sinning against God. The man and the woman are so reluctant to get started in this new manner of life that they must be driven out by God from the garden. From there, Moses, from giving us that answer, Moses continues his answer about what has gone so wrong by following Adam and Eve through Cain, down through human history and Cain's descendants, to demonstrate the nature of mankind's enslavement to sin. Cain does not serve as the lone example of a sinner in the world. You know, he's the new generation has a sinner and it's Cain, and there's another generation has a sinner and it's this other man. But rather, he's the foil for all of humanity. After him, he leaves. We'll get to this in a moment. But in his punishment for his murder of his brother, he leaves a willful rebellion against God. Many brothers and sisters go off with him to go establish a city. It's incredible. Now, what we see through that history, through the story of Cain and the way God had pleaded with him to repent and turn again and not fall prey to sin and more of sin, this warning God gives that sin would have him if he turned now and chose against God's pleas to repent and instead chose to go out and disobey God, to defy God, and act in anger against his brother. If that happened, sin would have him. And that's exactly what we see. Sin has humanity as a master, as its prey. And this works its way out. We come down through Cain's line, down eventually to the place where we get to this man named Lamech. And we read, and I've described it this way several times, what could be called the life and times and poetry of the great Lamech. And he seems to be a mountain of a man, not necessarily physically, but in terms of his importance to human history. And that this man, he took 2 wives, not a good thing, but he has these 2 women, and there are a number of children he has, and at least 3 of his boys are monumental figures in human history, in the development of human culture. Right? Verse 20, Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. An entire culture and manner of life came from this man. His brother's name was Jubal, and this man Jubal also was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. Musical instruments and that whole endeavor came from this man, Jubal. Then this other wife he had bore this other son of his, Tubal-Cain. He's the father or the forger of all instruments and bronze and iron. So all of this metallurgy and all this kind of work. Think about all the scientific endeavors or the creative endeavors that have to take place to become for people to go from hunter-gatherers to forgers of all instruments of bronze and iron. This man is the one who did this. So you've got 3 monumental figures of human history, all of whom have the same father. He fathered them all. What manner of man was this? And he has a daughter named Naamah, whose name means beautiful, lovely. Thousands of years later, her name is still remembered in the earth. Like, this guy had it going on. And yet, he's an example of all the progress of human history and also all the degradation. The poem he writes to his wives. What a love story. Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. What a threat. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge was sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So he wants to set the tone for his life and for his home life, and he writes a poem and sets it on the wall as a manner of plaque or something. Maybe he had Tubal Cain forged it in bronze as something that they could never forget. And here it is. And what does it say? I have killed, listen, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. And they're named in the poem. There's the threat. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I killed a man for wounding me. So some guy wounded me a bit, and so I killed him. Well, that's not hardly a fair punishment for someone that wounds you, strikes you in some way. But he clarifies, a young man for striking me. So he takes the boy who struck him, and he killed him. And we said it's even worse in that word for young boy often is translated as a son. And it's very possible he's threatening his wife by telling them what he did to one of their children or to some other wife that he had, to their children. And saying, look, I'm just telling you, mind the kids, do what I say, don't mess up. He's got two wives. The Bible will call them rival wives. They're already set up in this sort of a situation. This is the way he rules his home. And then he brags and boasts and says, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold. So Cain had committed this murder, and God protected him by putting a mark on him that would make it clear that if anyone murdered Cain or assaulted Cain, that God would personally take vengeance upon them sevenfold. So that was a real threat, and you would leave Cain alone because God was going to come and act in this way. But Lamech says, listen, my vengeance is 77-fold. God's got nothing on me. Cain's got nothing on me. Unlike Cain, who needed God to protect him, I'll do it myself, thank you. And unlike God, who was willing to execute vengeance sevenfold, I'll do 77-fold. And if you doubt me, don't remember Exhibit A, the young dead kid over there who wounded me. Now, wives of mine, remember that's what I'm like. And this is staggering to think that it's staggering to think like people tend to think the Bible is this good, clean book, but it's like you read something like this and you think, how could someone like this be in the Bible? Well, they're in the Bible because the Bible's primary goal is not to tell us clean stories, but true stories that will affect us in the ways we need to be affected. We need to know people are like this. Lamech's not an exception. I mean, we have this phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Here's a man who somehow gathered together to himself in the days in which he lived what others would probably have called absolute power and influence. And he's absolutely corrupted. This is exactly what we see throughout all of human history. This is the way things were. Yes, men are able to do great and amazing things. Human culture is advancing, but look at the sin and defilement. Look how bankrupt and wicked they are. And it all is just mixed in there together. And this is the situation we are in. But before the chapter closes, if we're still talking about what humanity really was like or what happened, there's still something more that we've got to say. And there were occasionally individuals who kind of dotted the landscape of the earth throughout its ongoing history who were amazing exceptions. They were not the rule, but they were exceptions, but they did exist. And it says at that verse, the last verse of the chapter, at that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Some would do that. And so you think, well, okay, tell me about it. Then if it's not just all the worst it could possibly be, and it looks bad, but there were some exceptions, well, what happened? And so Moses launches off in a new direction. In this new section of Moses' book, he undertakes to follow in sort of a genealogy, a history of mankind, which will eventually lead us to a certain person of interest, namely Noah. In one sense, if you know about the flood and you know why it came, think about this, and you've begun to tell the story of humanity's development of culture but slide into sin, You know where you're going. Like, you're going to get to Noah and tell about this and how bad it was. But he wants to do some things before he gets there, to tell us something, to not just have us just fast forward right to there. And so this is what this portion is about. Kind of, we slow down to say a few things and to get a better understanding of humanity in the world that God has made and what this looks like. And so this is what he does here. So along the way from Adam to Noah, there are some figures worth mentioning. And so he arranges his genealogy in such a way as to include these men and make comment on them. Also, as is common with similar things occurring several times in Genesis, we have 10 generations. He breaks up, however long this period of time was, he gives it to us in 10 generations, followed by, that 10th generation has 3 sons. That's a common occurrence in ancient genealogies. It's very often done. It's such a formula for these genealogies that it's often people think it's not an actual genealogy in the sense that we would think of it, this person to this person to this person to this person, and you have every person along the line and no gaps. I don't mean to debate any of that now. We've done that in the past and laid out all the arguments for those things. I just would say personally, I feel like the gaps is likely, but not certain. I'm very comfortable saying there aren't gaps, but I'm not going to disfellowship with someone who says there are. If you are curious about that or you don't remember all those things, go back and listen to, I think it's like message like 60, 61, 62, somewhere in there on this series. We deal with all that in detail. Now, I will say a few things about it as we go on, but I'm not going to belabor any of that now. But finally then, before moving on into a new direction yet, Moses makes clear that despite there being several notable men in this light, in this list, they were not in any way representative of a large movement of humanity. It wasn't like there was this groundswell of godliness within the earth, and it was kind of the tide was turning, and now things are going to get better. Like, that's not at all what happened, and Moses makes that very clear. These men were exceptions. One man did not taste death, yet all others died. Occasionally you'd find a man who regularly prayed, but this was no great movement on the earth. Rather, humanity would again shock us with the lengths to which they would sin and defy God and violate the order of creation that He had established. And you get that in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. In response to this defilement, God Himself would destroy the vast majority, God determined, rather, to destroy the vast majority of His creation, wiping away its defilement. However, this man named Noah found favor in God's sight, and that's where our section for today ends. And then it kind of picks up with, well, then what became of Noah? I mean, if God was going to do this, but Noah found favor in God's sight, God was going to give grace to Noah, what would come of the grace that Noah was going to receive from God? And that's where the Genesis 6:9 launches out after that. So, let's just begin at this section then, chapter 5 and verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In here you thought you were reading a book called the Bible. And then you thought you were reading a book called Genesis. And within that is this other book called the book of the generations of Adam. Well, what is it? Well, you remember I hope you remember, we had talked about as Moses has written Genesis, he hasn't just, it's not all, he's not the original writer of everything. Sometimes he's gathering up records and histories. And this is the only place in the book of Genesis where you have this book mentioned like this, the book of the generations of Adam. And you could imagine, to have a copy of that. Now, none of us could read it, right? We don't read that language, whatever that language had been. But it was accessible to Moses. Perhaps it was on file in Egypt, right? But Moses had it. He walked out of Egypt with it. Perhaps the family had always had this. We don't know. But this is the book of the generations of Adam. He doesn't just say like he does with the other ones, these are the generations of so-and-so, and tell his story. For this is the book. This is the book of the generations of Adam. So it's a fresh copy, likely edited. It's not likely that whatever that that book was that Moses writes it down just as it was. He's got his own purposes, but nonetheless, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Now, debating in my mind how much of this debate I want to get into. I'll say it this way. Be careful before we launch into what Moses' point is in all of this. Be careful about the years here. This guy lived this many years, father so-and-so, and then, he lived this many years afterwards. Thus, all the years of his life are, X plus Y number of years, and then he died. The math works out. Good. The math works out even when the flood comes, that everyone who should have died by the flood, they died in the flood, like that's the year they died. Whether they died that year or they died in the flood, they died. Nobody besides Noah and those on the ark with him, those 8 souls, lived past that. Works out. But we're reading our English translations from the Masoretic text, which is, it's not the same thing, but you might think of it as a helpful way as the majority text. It's kind of the text it's kind of the majority of our Hebrew text, right? But then there's also these other versions of the Old Testament. There's the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which doesn't agree in terms of the years. Some of them are switched around, changed. That's difficult because most of the time we look at the Septuagint as a very reliable translation. In fact, most of the time the New Testament, when it quotes the Old, quotes the Septuagint very frequently. And you think, well, that's okay, how big of a deal is it? Well, it's over a 300-year difference in terms of the years. It's more than that. What I mean to say is this. If you want to date the flood, you'd say, well, this guy lived this many years, then he had this kid. And then that kid lived this many years, and he had this one. And you add up the years from a guy's birth to when he had the child mentioned. That's the number of years. Then you add the next guy. How long did he live before he had the next kid? And you do this. I don't need to know how long Adam lived to get the date of the flood. And how old was he when he had this son? How old was that son when he had this son? And eventually we get to Noah. Noah was this old when the flood happened. And I can add up those first years of everybody's lives before they had this kid, and then figure out a date. If I'm following our Bibles here, we would get 1,656 years between Adam's creation and the flood. If we add up the Septuagint, we get 2,262 years. If we add up the Sumerian, the Samaritans, they had their version, we only get 1,307 years. So we get big differences. And they're different in strange ways. For instance, the Masoretic text, the Hebrew translations that we have, or copies we have, and the Greek, the Septuagint, agree on all the final ages of everyone, except Lamech. They don't agree on this final age on Lamech. But they do differ on the ages when the prominent son was born, typically by 100 years, except for Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech. The Samaritan version agrees with the majority text, the Masoretic text, on all things, everything, up until Jared, where dates begin getting shorter and final ages of the men shrink in order to make sure everyone's dead by the flood. It's like, well, what? So some look at that and just say, well, those numbers are just useless, right? Moses shouldn't even, they just don't work because we got all these different versions and we can't do anything about it. I don't agree with that at all, but that's, some think that. Some people look at this and say, well, look, you've got, this kind of thing is done in other cultures. You've got like the Sumerian kings list. You've got their whole flood account and stuff. And their ancient history starts with, you've got all these men, these great kings and their kingdoms, and they ruled as kings for all these years. And there was this flood, and then after the flood, there were these other kings, and they ruled for not as long, but for a long time. And they would say, well, that's similar to the Bible, where you got these people who lived these great lives, long lives, and then the flood, and then people still live long lives, but not as long. They say, see, it's just common. But their things are crazy. Like they have a list of kings totaling 241,200 years before the flood. And those, let me give you, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 men, 8 kings ruled for 241,200 years. One of them ruled for 28,800. The next ruled for 36,000. The next king ruled for 43,200 years. The next one, 28,800. Then another 36. Then another 28,800. Then 21,000. Then 18,600. You think, okay, like none of us think that was an actual person. Then you had the flood. Then you had 39 kings after the flood who reigned for a total of 26,997 years. It's crazy. But people look at that and say, see, it's exaggerated, but you've got the same kind of thing here. Well, this isn't a list of kings, and it doesn't claim to be a list of kings. This is a list of people, not kings. Just because you could easily imagine, here's our true story. And in the cultures of the world after the flood, one of the things that continues is there were great long lives in great men who had lived before the flood. And after the flood, there were still some who had lived long lives, and there were still some great men, but they didn't attain to what had been attained before. And you can see how an inventive culture, inventing a history, denying the true God, but yet still having to hold on to certain things, would imagine and exaggerate in these ways. The years get longer. The men get greater. Right? The gods get more capricious and just arbitrary. The reasons for flooding us wasn't really deserved. It was just kind of the gods are just easily agitated. And these sorts of things happen. And these are exactly the ways that these other stories tell the narrative. False claims by false religions are not surprising. So there's this. What else? Some see the number of the names and say that because of this 10 names followed by 3 descendants, there's the names, it goes, Adam, Seth, and it goes on down 10 names, gets to Lamech, and then it gives his 3 sons. Because of this 10-3 pattern, that we can't say for certain we're dealing with direct descendants. And I tend to agree with that, that we can't say we're dealing with direct descendants. There are too many other times in the Bible where we have these genealogies where we know because of other records within the Bible that names are skipped, and they're skipped in order to get certain people to end up on certain numbered names. For instance, in the New Testament, we have 14 generations and 14 generations and 14 generations, and if you were to go back and look at your Bibles, it's not 14 generations. Luke's making a point. He's just making a point. And that would have been accepted, not thought it to be a lie at all back then. It was very common practice. You have thousands and thousands of generations maybe, and you want to tell the history from this person to this person, you give it in 10 people. You're like, well, that's not right. Well, you can say this guy, couldn't an Israelite of Jesus' day say Abraham is our father? They did. Were they all liars? Or was this Abraham that popular of a name that the entire generation of men, of males, was all named Abraham, right, before the generation of people who were talking to Jesus? I don't think that was the case, right? They were talking about Abraham, their father Abraham. We could talk about Adam as our father. Some of us could talk about Adam as our father in a different way, right? But Adam is my father, but I don't mean that the same way that Hannah means that. But Hannah and I could also mean that. She could say Adam is my father in a way that I could say it too. That this Adam from our story is her father, right? And I can say, though I'm not in any way related physically to Abraham that I know of, I can say Abraham is my father, and I mean father in terms of by faith. It's a totally different way of talking, but we all understand what I mean by that. Well, just like there are also conventions used in these genealogies, if I say so-and-so lived this many years and they fathered this person, they may have fathered them directly. That's very likely. But it also could be used to say, at this time, was born a son, and that eventually that man who was born who's not named resulted in a man who was named this guy. Right? And so it's this way. And our genealogies work that way. And they don't tell us, these genealogies in the Bible don't go out and tell us, now we're talking about great-great-great-grandson on this next name. It just uses the same word fathered that it used for the other ones where we know it was direct descendants. It's a convention of these genealogies that the writers expect us to understand and to be okay with. But most of us, because this all seems so foreign to us, we don't understand it. And so I'm not saying that it's definitely what's happening in this genealogy. I'm saying it may well be what happens in this genealogy. So it's an important enough issue. It's divisive enough among Christians. I just feel like it's warranted to say again, even though, and hear me out on this, that is not Moses' point. It's just not. He means to speak about these men as real men. And I think he certainly means to refer to these men, the length of their lives, as real lives of real men. They did live that long. There's a purpose for that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But as we consider this chapter and we kind of want to glean from it what we can, one of the things we first notice is this pattern to the names. Let's Seth at verse 6 and kind of look at that. When Seth lived for 105 years. So, man A, when A lived for X years, he fathered B. A lived after he fathered B for Y years and had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of man A were X plus Y years, and he died. And they all kind of follow that formula, this pattern, except for three of them. Adam does not follow that pattern. Enoch does not follow that pattern. And this man named Lamech, a different Lamech than before, does not follow that pattern. So they stand out as different, which ought to draw our attention to them. Like you're reading something, it happens sometimes, doesn't it? Like maybe you're listening to something on the radio and this person's voice is kind of monotonous, and even though they're saying different things, you just kind of, there's a rhythm and a cadence to it, and you just kind of think, and the next thing you know, you're not even hardly paying attention, and then you just notice, wait a minute, what did he say? That was different. And you want to listen again. And it's this way, there's this pattern, and it's not meant to make us bored or anything, but it's this pattern, and then when they break the pattern, it's to highlight, hey, this is something different, pay attention here. It's not that the things said in the pattern are unimportant, but breaking the pattern is certainly a sign of importance. Wake up, listen in, listen carefully. So Adam, Enoch, and Lamech, and we'll look at those men in a moment. Now, the point of this chapter, what do we have? You have a couple things, I think. First of all, these long lives that the men live. It's incredible. I think indicates for us, ought to show that even though this curse had come, there was still this blessing of God upon humanity in so many ways. To be fruitful and multiply. Such long ages. Do you think that men like Tubal-Cain would have developed into a forger of all instruments of bronze and iron if he died at 70? No way. We got people living long lives, and the reason they're living long lives is because God's purpose for humanity is still to flourish, to expand, to grow, to develop. The growth of human culture and population was still on God's mind. And in these early years of humanity, of the earth, men needed to live long for this to develop in the way God wanted it to, in the pace that God wanted it to. We also see this doctrine the New Testament brings out, which we call original sin. The totality of that doctrine would be both we inherit the consequence of sin, namely death from Adam, but also we inherit a sinful nature from him. Now, I don't mean to say necessarily that Genesis 5 indicates that we all inherited this sinful nature from Adam, but it certainly shows we inherited the consequence of sin, namely all died. And I know there's one exception, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but all died. This is amazing. Other than Abel being murdered, We have not yet read of anyone, and of this other person that Lamech killed, this unnamed young boy. Everyone else we just read about their life. We're never told how long Cain lived, when he died, but he did die. We know that. But Moses spells it out for us in this endless refrain and this pattern. And he died. Next guy. And he died. Next one. And he died. And he died. And he died. And he died. And it's like that threat that you had heard from God, and the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Seth didn't eat of it. Why is he dying? Because Adam sinned. And for that sin, all die. And he died. And what about this one? They were born. Well, he died. Well, this guy, then what about, he's like 5 generations removed from what Adam did. What happened to him? Well, he died. They all died. Sin reigned and death through sin. You see it here. Okay. Now let's look at these men briefly, these 3 men. Adam, Enoch, and Lamech. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. Male and female He created them, and He blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. Now what's the difference there in those 2 verses? It's the image. The image is different. When God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. The image, it's that word, the image of God. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. Now, in one sense, Adam's image is the image of God, so we don't need to tell us that. We know that Seth was still made in the image of God, but this slight change on it clues us into the fact that Moses is trying to subtly point us to this and show us this, that there was this difference. That even though something about this doctrine of original sin, that though when man was made, he was made pristine and innocent from the hand of God. But every man that's made after that from Adam is made in the image of Adam. A creature in the image of God, yes, but marked by sin. And a dominance by sin. He's under the sway of it. He's bent, he's crooked. The image is there, but it's just so different than it was before. It's murky, it's hazy, it's been marred. Somebody took an eraser to it or a big marker through it. It's not what it should have been. And this is what all of these men are. They're not what Adam was initially. They're what Adam was when he began to have children. A sinner on the earth. There's this difference. What else? What about this other man, Enoch? Let's look at verse 18. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. We couldn't find him. He just was not there. And the explanation is, for God took him. He walked with God. The only one of whom that's been said about so far. He walked with God. Kind of a throwback to what Adam and God must have been doing before the naming of the animals, right? They heard God, remember, even after the sin, walking in the cool of the garden, cool of the day. And here he is. Enoch is walking with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years. Maybe this was a new thing. Maybe at 65 years old he had a son and then began walking with God. Or maybe he walked with God, but even after he had his son, for the next 300 years he was walking with God while he had other sons and daughters. But this man stands out. I mean, this is what humanity was supposed to be doing all along, walking with God. But this man was doing it. He was walking with God, and he was not, for God took him. God spared him. God spared him from death. It's an amazing thing. God's free to do that. It's not the only time he's done that, right? There was a prophet who went off into heaven, right? But it happened. This man's an exception. I feel like just as much as this text causes us to say, well, I want to know more, and it was no cause of, there was no shortage of speculation on this verse in Israelite history and what it could mean. But just as it causes us to say, I want to know more, stop, and rather than complain there's not more written, stop and say, well, what is written? What should I get based on what's here? That'd be the better answer, because Moses gave us these things. So one thing that, to me, it just says, this is the absolute exception. It hits that drumbeat again of everybody's dying, everybody's dying. This man didn't, but everyone else did. What was the difference? He walked with God. Big highlighter, underscore, the difference, the reason men die is not because there's some weird thing that happened in the world, there's poison water or something, it's because they're not walking with God. It's the severance of this relationship that's still the thing that plagues mankind. Everybody dies because nobody walks with God. That's the thing. However much you might say positively about Adam's kind of turn when he kind of calls his wife's name Eve and there's a hopeful response, he wasn't walking with God. What do you want to say about Abel? Well, he was accepted. His sacrifice and his offering was accepted. And he was righteous in that sense. But he wasn't walking with God like Enoch necessarily. Well, what about these other men? It doesn't say they walked with God. There are many people who look at this and say, well, this is the godly line. Genesis 5, you have the evil line of Cain and the godly line of Seth. You got one guy here that says he walked with God. One. However many people there were all kinds of other sons and daughters, every generation, there were tons of them. You got one person was it said that they walked with God. Don't tell me this is the godly line. You could say this is the line within which there were some godly people. Fine. But it's not like these are God's people. All these people named here, they're real men of God. You've got one that's mentioned. And we're going to have another, but you've got one. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. All right, then Lamech. Lamech. It's like, after all you just got done saying in chapter 4 about that Lamech, why bring another Lamech in, right? Don't do that. It's like the point is to contrast these men. Each line has a Lamech. They end with a Lamech, right? Cain's line is told in such a way that ends with this man Lamech. You think, oh no, he's terrible. And he's seventh in the genealogy for Cain from Adam. So it's like from Adam, 7 generations in, which is kind of this, this full, complete number. What do we get? Well, we get Lamech. This is what we get of human culture. It's terrible. Well, for Adam's line in the book of the generations of Adam, from Adam on, 7th is Enoch, and he walked with God. And then the 10th name is Lamech. And what about Lamech? I'm sorry, the 9th name is Lamech. 10th name is Noah. But so you have the 9th name, Lamech. And you think, well, that's not a significant number, but it's the significant name that matters. Why include him? Well, let's read about this Lamech. When he lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our works and from the painful toil of our hands. Sort of a prophet, in a sense. Or maybe you could read it that way. Or you could read it as maybe he's hopeful that what had begun in chapter 5, at the end of chapter 4, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. They began to see that it wasn't going to be just one of their descendants was eventually going to just overturn all this and set things right. They really needed God to help. They needed God to do this. They began to call upon the name of the Lord. You've got Enoch eventually walking with God. There's someone who certainly would have been calling on the name of the Lord. Then you come to Lamech. And in contrast to that other Lamech, this Lamech looks to God himself. Not an evil man, but rather a godly man. in some respects. He doesn't, when life goes wrong, he doesn't look to threaten others, but rather he sees the ill things that happen to him in his life as a result of God's curse out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, right, he says? And he looks to God for deliverance. This one shall bring us relief from our work, from the painful toil of our hands. He's thinking about the things that God had said, that had been passed on to him, and he says, this, maybe now, after all this time, things have gotten so bad, we're so desperate. And there begins to be this rising hope, at least in Lamech, the sense of desperation. Hundreds and hundreds of years after Seth, Lamech is looking to God and saying, and naming his son Noah, meaning rest. Perhaps this one will be the one that would give us rest. And it turns out to be something of a prophecy. What a contrast between these two men, Lamech. Well, Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Now after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we've looked at the dates and things on this, and we understand, I hope, that doesn't mean at 500 years old Noah fathered triplets, right? Or 3 children in a year. Or that he would live for 500 years and then he had one of them, and then he had another, and then he had another. But rather, after he lived 500 years, he had fathered these 3 men. By the time he got to 500 years old, he had children, and at least 3 of them were named Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay? That's what we need to understand there. Now, we're still going on. I tend to think that Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 is sort of its own thing in here. It's not the book of the generations of Adam, and it's not the generations of Noah. It's kind of this hinge where he's telling us, okay, look, I've given you these generations of Adam, and I've told you what I want you to tell you there, but now picking back up then in our narrative and the issues that we are dealing with, how does Lamech's hope fit in the context of the world created by the other Lamech? The world in which the other Lamech is the hero and his sons are dominating and everything. That kind of a world, how does this Lamech's son Noah, in his hopes for Noah, fit and work out in this world that we're in? Why have I bothered to tell you about this Noah? Well, let's back up. He says, okay, well, what has been happening in all of this, chapter 6, verse 1, when man began to multiply, which you've just been telling us all about, on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Now, we read that, and we don't quite understand it all, and I'll try to lay some groundwork for it in a moment. But let's keep going. So God looks out during all this time as this is happening, and God sees this thing happening, and He makes a determination. Verse 3, Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in or contend with man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. God makes that determination. And then we get some further explanation about things that were going on. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And then we read God's grief at the wickedness of man and His determination to destroy what has become of His creation, almost. Verse 5, we read about the Lord's assessment again. The Lord saw, we could say, indeed, that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's how bad it was. And it stirred up in God an emotional response, the only way to describe it. Verse 6, And the Lord was sorry that He had made man on the earth, and it grieved Him to His heart. Talk about that in a moment. Verse 7, we read the Lord's response of judgment. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. It sounds like God is going to undo all of His creation. It's just so bad, it's so corrupt, it's so wicked, we're just going to destroy it all. But then you read about the Lord's grace. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And the feeling you get is that it's all over. God's going to hit the reset button, or at least the delete button. Maybe not reset, but certainly at least delete what's here. But Noah found favor and think, well, what's God going to do? What is that going to mean? Well, these are the generations of Noah. Let me tell you about Noah and how all this worked out. How did Noah and this favor that he had with God alter the judgment that that the earth deserved and that God was willing to do? How did Noah, God's assessment of the world, but then also of Noah in the world, change what God was otherwise willing to do? And that's what 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all about. Now, let's look then at Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, and what we've already kind of read here a little bit. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. There's a massive debate that has raged throughout time for all believers who've had this text as to what this means. And there are all sorts of different opinions, but it comes down to what this phrase, the sons of God, might mean. And I don't mean to go into all that debate, but will say this, I'll lay these things down. Sons of God in the Bible always refers to, as far as I'm aware, to angels, particularly in the Old Testament, always to angels. Now, culturally, that phrase sons of God or a son of God often refers to a king or a mighty man. He's a son of God. And ultimately, we see that phrase applied to the Lord Jesus Christ as the ultimate Son of God. When we read that phrase, Son of God, most of the time in the New Testament, we think it means literally one who is a son of God Himself. And we're not wrong in the sense that because Jesus is actually God's Son. But what it really means, culturally, the way this phrase is used, is that among men, this one is a son of God. He rules among men as though he were a god. He's God's favored one. He's the one who's has God's right and approval to rule as a son, in a sense. And this is what we mean basically by this phrase, Son of God, is what's often meant. And so you have some people take it as, well, sons of God always means angels. It's got to be angels. And other people say, well, sometimes that phrase, Son of God, refers to a mighty man, and maybe that's what it means. Other people say, well, it has to do with these two lines. Sons of God was the godly line of Seth, and the daughters of men were the ungodly line of Cain. And it's like, what? I don't get that here. But so, as strange as it is to talk about angels somehow having intercourse with women, there's the New Testament text which seems to underscore this is in fact what happened. And I'll just go to this one place in Jude. You can turn there with me if you want. The tiny little book right before Revelation. And we read this phrase. Now this statement. And I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. Okay, and let me give another example. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, their proper habitation. Those angels he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. And the question is, what do you mean, just as? You could read this text and say, just like these angels who did wrong, God's got them in chains, so also Sodom and Gomorrah, who sinned in terms of sexual immorality and unnatural desire, also serve as an example. You could leave it at that. Or you could say, just as these angels had sinned in ways that aren't, by not staying in their own domain, so also Sodom and Gomorrah sinned sexually and pursued unnatural desire. And that sounds, okay, now you're saying the angels are something to do with that. It's that parallel about sexual immorality and unnatural desire, referring to the angels, is heightened by the fact that what Jude is doing there is basically quoting another text that the Jews had, where this interpretation of Genesis 6, referring to angels somehow intermarrying, in a sense, with humans, is described. And so it seems like the New Testament is confirming that interpretation. Seems like, admittedly, seems like. My own position is that I think the rest of the text fleshes out for us a bit how we ought to understand this. It's some sort of a combination of the two. What do I mean? Well, let's just look at it this way. They took as their wives any they chose. You've got massive harems of women being created by these men, or these sons of God, let's call them that. They see these women who they're attracted to, and they just gather them up, take them. They don't enter into covenant. They don't give, you'll give me your daughter in marriage, I'll give you my daughter, this sort of thing that happened many times culturally for communities to come together in peace. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened. It wasn't the giving of wives. It was taking women who they saw attractive. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Let's look at verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. Some people read this verse and they think, oh, the Nephilim, it says, your footnote might say the giants, these great men, these mighty, mighty men, the big men of old. Not referring here to giants, but referring to mighty men. And the idea here is that, I think, is that probably just like we read in the New Testament, there are demonic possession where men have gained, in a sense, powers, in a sense. Like they can't be chained, they can't be, withheld. That something about these sons of God has to do with religious observance, some form of idolatry. These men are possessed in some way. They are mighty in battle. They are men who they determine to do a thing. They're not stopped. They take as their wives any they choose to say, well, she belongs to this man. And the whole town comes against him. It doesn't matter. This guy can't be stopped. He can't be bound. He can't be denied. He takes whoever he chooses. Whomever he chooses. It's an unnatural strength. Now, these men have that, and these sons of God have that, and they take all these women to themselves, and they have children, and these children themselves are in a similar way. It's an ongoing thing. Are also mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And you ought not read that as think, oh, these were amazing men, but rather your heart should be pricked when you hear that. These were the men of renown. These were the great men who the stories are written about. These men who themselves were involved in demonic, activity, who themselves were just taking anybody they chose to be their wives, no matter what the consequences were. These men who used their might to take and rob and steal from others and gain things for themselves. These were the men, the famous men of old, those Nephilim we've heard about. This is what they were involved in. That's the pinnacle of mankind at that time. Yes, that was it. And the result, so God looks at that though, and you ought not think these are just mighty spiritual beings, because God looks at them and says, verse 3, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. God looks out upon the things happening and calls it's just flesh. And just going to wipe it out. His days shall be 120 years. These mighty men of old, they're just flesh. God just determines to make an end to them. The Lord saw, as he looks out and observes this, that the wickedness of man, all of them, was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the prime example of that is the great men who were known of old as being great men, mighty men, were these kind of men. This is terrible. And the Lord was sorry that he even made man on the earth. It's like maybe things would go on different if some sort of a creature besides a man was in charge. But because he made men on the earth, everything's defiled. Therefore, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I'm sorry that I've made them. What a thing. This is the self-same God from Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, the mighty, the Elohim, the mighty one who spoke the world into creation, made it all, sanctified it unto himself, was satisfied with his work, enjoying it, consecrated it to him. It was wonderful. This same God gets to the place and he says, I am sorry I made man on the earth. It's so painful to me to see what man has done to this thing. Now, there are a lot of things I could probably relate this to, but one of the things that comes to mind, I can remember growing up in a home, and my parents did a lot of work on that house while we were there. Lots of work. Lots of summers spent building this thing, doing this thing, adding this on. All those things were done. Sold the house. 5-6 years later, come back. What? Oh no, they didn't keep it up. Everything's just trashed. This is no good. Then eventually new owners came, took care of it, but because things weren't taken care of, undid so many of the things we did because those things weren't maintained, and now it's all just gone. We got to do something different. And you see that, but I remember driving by and just thinking, no, like, do you know how much work went into this and how nice this could be? And it's just destroyed. And then what do the next people do? They just got to tear it all out. It's no good. You're never going to, it's all rotten now. It could have been maintained, but it wasn't. It was the people that were supposed to rule this place and govern it and keep it have defiled it, and now the only thing to do is just to destroy it all and start over. And this is the way God looks upon His creation. I'm sorry that I made man. It's like we could say, I'm sorry we sold it to them. If someone else would have had it, it would have been different. But they had it, and now it's all got to be destroyed. And this is the way God looks out upon His creation. When the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, and the Lord was sorry that He had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to His heart, so the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. It's incredible. This is what became of humanity and of the earth. Even enjoying so many of the blessings of God, even just being a handful of generations removed from Adam, from creation itself, humanity plunged the earth into this sort of decadence and defilement and wickedness. It's awful. God's not, He looks out upon the earth, think of this, and He's justified, and He's, in a sense, though He's grieved to do it, He's contented to say the right response is to destroy it all. Remember that. Right? We think we can think about God somehow sending someone to hell and thinking, oh, that's, it's so awful that God would do that or something. That's not. This is the proper response. The fact that there's anything here at all is owing to the kindness of God. Verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. There was this lone man who stood out as different, righteous in his generation. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord. We're not immediately told why, but in the context, surely you have to, even without reading in the rest of chapter 6, surely you have to say Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord because somehow he was different than all of this. God looks upon here and says He's going to rightly judge them for these things, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This man Noah, what would come of him? So the point, why Moses doesn't just bring us right into Noah and how bad things got in his day. He wants to slow down. He wants us to see death falling upon individuals, every individual, but upon individuals. Not just, well, the world kind of went on for a while and then God flooded and killed them all. Like, no, people were dying, and then another person, they didn't just all live until the flood. They died, and they died, and then they died, and then they died. Death was a common thing. Long life, yes, but death, and everyone died. Between Adam and ultimately even Moses, between Adam and Noah, people are dying all the time because of what Adam did. That one consequence. But also, humanity itself is plunged, by and large, into absolute slavery to sin, such that the earth itself gets this way. The long lives, yes, meant massive amounts of cultural advancement and invention, but also meant new ways of sinning. People will get creative in all new ways. And as all of this was going on, as man was multiplying on the face of the land, the daughters were born to them, these sorts of things were happening in increased number. And eventually the Lord looked upon these things, and He'd had enough. He wasn't going to be patient any longer. He numbered the days of flesh, 120 years. And 120 years later, He flooded the earth. Well, admittedly, it's a very negative sort of message. But certainly we can equally admit that it's a necessary message. These are necessary truths. We need these examples. We need to understand how bad things get apart from the grace of God. It wasn't much better, of course, you remember at all. Later on, after the flood, we read the Tower of Babel. Like humanity's at it again, this time in a more direct defiance. And out of that context, God saves a man named Abram, calls him out of his false religion and to serve the true God. It's an amazing thing. So, in one sense, it's just kind of part two of all that had happened, all that Moses had been doing in telling us with regard to Cain and Abel and Cain's descendants. But in another sense, he shows us these examples. He reminds us the regularity of death, the deservedness of death. He shocks us again with another example of how far men go in their defilement of the world. And also shocks us by the way he describes what would have only been known in other cultures as the great mighty men of renown of old, and saying, yeah, this is what they were like. This is what that culture, the golden days of yesteryear, this is what it was. Nothing to be desired. They glory in their shame. Right? Well, questions or comments on this portion? Tried to go through it as quickly and faithfully as we could.